Welcome back to the Center for Medical Simulation. This is Curious Now, a podcast led by me, Jenny Rudolph, an organizational behavior scholar, really interested in all the ways we glitch and glimmer as we try to interact with other people. What are our thoughts? What are our feelings? How do they help us? How do they get in our way? And this week, we're continuing our series on how do you build psychological safety for yourself, for your team, and for your organization. And we're continuing on thinking about how do we build psychological safety for our team using Amy Edmondson's The Leader's Toolkit for Building Psychological Safety, a wonderful distillation of her ideas that appear in the book, The Fearless Organization: How to Build Psychological Safety for Learning, Innovation, and Growth. So in the Leader's Toolkit, Amy Edmondson divides up the work into setting the stage. And last week, we completed talking about that. Setting the stage includes framing the work, which is why are we here? What are we doing? How are we going to do it? And emphasizing the purpose behind the work. Why is this important? Why should we care? What am I asking you to bring to this moment? So setting the stage is part one of the work. Inviting participation is part two of the work. And then responding productively is part three of the work, or I should say her toolkit. And this week, we're going to start exploring how do you invite participation. This seems like such an obvious and good idea, but I think there's a paradox in leadership. And I certainly experienced this when I was a much younger leader. And that is, as a 29-year-old, for example, I had taken over a small public policy consulting firm, and I kind of thought I should perform leadership. And that included thinking that I needed to project certainty and clarity and confidence. And certainly I do think clarity and confidence are very useful in leaders and leadership because it allows you to create a container for people to work in and a pathway for them to follow. The problem with certainty, though, if it's not accompanied by what Amy Edmondson calls situational humility, it can tend to shut down conversation. It can tend to shut down input. So I'd like to start with a story of the opposite of that. This occurred when I was a doctoral student, and I spent 3 summers doing research with John Carroll at the Sloan School of Management at MIT. And John was an expert and is an expert in naturalistic decision-making, but his area of research at that time was learning from accident and error in nuclear power and chemical processing. And as an avid rock climber at the time and someone absolutely fascinated with the role of mindfulness in safety and in preventing accidents and errors, when John offered me the opportunity to work on this project, I jumped at it. On this particular summer, we were invited down to Louisiana to basically shadow an accident investigation team that was looking into a $16 million explosion that had happened at a plant there. No injuries, no fatalities, but plenty of busted metal, scorched earth, damaged equipment, delayed production timelines. It was a very serious situation. And what blew me and John away, I believe, about shadowing the team was their level of situational humility as they explored with the employees who had been involved in the explosion what had been going on for them that day and how they caringly used amazing questions to find out lots of counterintuitive things that contributed to that explosion that day. And those two things, situational humility and good questions, are the heart of inviting participation, according to Amy Edmondson's research. So what Amy Edmondson and Jim Dieter looked at, in part, was what are the calculations each of us humans make when we decide whether to speak up or remain silent, or as they call it, what is the voice silence calculation? And to think about this, they have us consider the following. If you imagine a table with 2 rows, and 1 row is voice, and 1 row is silence, and you have some columns, and I'm going to walk us through what those are. So when you're considering speaking up, one of the things you're going to think about is who benefits? If I speak up, they argue that the organization and or its customers is going to benefit. And if I remain silent, especially if I'm unsure of the outcome, as I often am, I benefit. Oneself, I benefit. The next thing they inquire into is, when does that benefit occur? So let's say I speak up about a problem that I see in my organization. It's likely that nothing is really going to happen right away. It's going to be after some delay. And if I remain silent, the benefit accrues to me immediately. So it's both I get a benefit and I get it right away. Then the third thing they look at is, what is the certainty of the benefit? So if I speak up, their research found that most of us think there's a low certainty of benefit because we don't know how it's going to land on our higher ups or other people. Maybe they're going to think we're impertinent. Maybe they're going to retaliate against us. Maybe they're going to think we're wrong. And what is the certainty of benefit from remaining silent? Most of us think high. Nothing bad's going to happen if I don't speak up. So they argue that why silence wins in the voice silence calculation is because we think silence benefits me immediately and with some certainty. And when I speak up, in contrast, the organizational benefit after some delay, maybe. So coming back to the story of the accident investigation team at the petrochemical plant, why their approach to participation was so important is that everybody who was involved in that explosion was essentially making that silence voice calculation. Although they were going to be asked direct questions by the accident investigation team, what they shared, how much they shared, what detail they went into was entirely up to them. And what the accident investigation team did to overcome these barriers was, first of all, constantly name the fact that they weren't at that workplace that day. They didn't know what that particular worker, whether it was an engineer, whether it was a person in charge of cleaning of the heaters that were involved, or whether it was a manager in charge of deciding how much and how hot and how high that heater should be run that day. They highlighted that they did not know what that person was up against and conveyed their deep positive regard and interest for the different trade-offs that that person might have been making that day when they did the things that they did. The second thing that they did was they asked really great questions. So what happened in this charge heater fire is that 3 things came together. The plant, the particular part of the plant, was running much hotter than usual. 2, heat was dissipating more slowly than usual because of a new cleaning approach. And 3rd, that higher heat was not detected, resulting in a 2-inch tube of steel, a tube of steel with 2-inch thick walls exploding. So one of the questions they asked was the engineer who's in charge of knowing how hot the heater was running to just walk them through his process for detecting how high and how hot that tube was. This doesn't seem like a very fancy question, but as soon as you ask people to walk you through what is their work process or walk you through what is their thought process, all of a sudden you learn really interesting things about what people are thinking. And in this case, he said, well, my job is to determine the heat, and I do that by looking through something called a thermocouple, and it tells me the heat of the tube at the height that I'm looking at it. What they discovered later is, of course, the hottest part of the tube was not where the thermocouple was, because the tube was being run at a hotter heat than its design basis. And so the hottest part was above the thermocouple, and so therefore that risk was not detected. But had they not been able to ask these really good questions, and had people not felt psychologically safe to answer them, they would never have been able to put all the pieces together of what caused this charge, heat, or fire and explosion. As you listen to me, you may think, this is super obvious, Jenny. Like, of course they can't know what's going on with those people. We've all been in those situations where something terrible goes wrong and everybody feels so stressed, and the higher ups themselves feel at risk, and the entire approach is much more punitive and much less curious and respectful. And so in the book, The Fearless Organization, Amy Edmondson talks about this with the example of looking at how safety incidents were handled in a children's hospital in Minnesota a number of years ago. And the same exact principles applied, which is the leader of the initiative conveyed that she didn't understand exactly how work was done, for example, on a neonatal unit. And she asked really great questions of the people on those units to find out what was going on for them at that day when something bad happened. The accident investigation team that we shadowed issued their report, but in a very interesting way. It wasn't just written down on a piece of paper as was done in those days and put on a shelf. It was presented by not only the accident investigation team, but they asked people who had been involved in the incident to be part of a dialogue when their findings were presented and to correct, change, and share their point of view in case anything had been missed. So the habit of demonstrating situational humility and asking good questions continued in microcycles throughout the investigation. But the cherry on the top of this, I think, for me, was we had an opportunity to sit in on a staff meeting type meeting for the plant. And this was now some months after this accident had occurred, but relatively close to the time when the accident investigation had come out. And a new plant manager was in place. And the team that was in charge of the output of the plant was giving their report about how much the plant had produced that month or that week. And it was slightly over projected amount. And the team was really happy and at the productivity and presented their findings. And the plant manager thanked them and then said, I'm really happy to hear that. I don't know if he said, I'm happy. He said, that's interesting or something like that. And then he said, I'd like to know, though, what corners, if any, were cut to achieve this production goal. I'm being really quiet right now because in the room, you could have heard a pin drop. And I think that question alone continued to change the culture at that plant. Pin drop. I think that question alone, such a good question, also was part of the cycles of inviting participation and changing the norms. Because what the plant manager was saying is productivity is good, output is good, but not at the cost of safety. And so I, from that point on in my life, really realized that as a leader, whether it's in a duet, a team, or an organization, what I convey counts, has a huge impact on what people are going to focus on and how they participate. Because prior to that question, I don't think anybody in the plant would have said, hey, we didn't do the X procedure, but we got the Y level of throughput. And he was signaling, I want to open up this whole area as something we talk about. So we're talking about how do you invite participation on your team as part of creating psychological safety. And I've talked about demonstrating situational humility, which is saying, hey, I may be the leader here. I might be the leader of this root cause investigation. I might be the leader of this team. I might be the leader of this meeting. And I may be missing something important here, and I hope you'll let me know if I am. Or I don't have the full perspective here, and I hope you'll share your perspective. Those are examples of situational humility in that context. And asking good questions is the other thing we've spoken about. Because of the calculus most of us engage in, that voice is more risky than silence, or speaking up is more risky than silence, it is particularly important as the leader of a team and or even in a duet or smaller group that I or we invite speaking up. And that is because of the sociology of the risk of speaking up. So continuing with some work of Amy Edmondson's and her colleague Ingrid Nembard, they looked at what kind of leader behaviors tend to allow people to speak up. And in their investigation, part of what they describe is that the higher up I am in the hierarchy, generally, the more psychologically safe I feel, because I have more autonomy, I have more authority, I have a broader span of what I may be aware of, and I gravely underestimate the risks that other people perceive to speaking up. And so because of this, in their article, Keeping It Safe, on the role of leader inclusiveness behaviors, they highlight how important it is to ask for input early and often. And so part of good inquiry is not just interesting questions or important questions or digging into unexpected things, but it is the habit of simply recognizing that I, as the leader, only have part of the picture, and I need to make it safe as possible for people to share with me their perspective. And so inviting that in the following way: here's what I think so far, what am I missing? Hey, this is how I'm thinking about it, but what concerns do you have? I think we should do X, Y, Z, but who sees this differently? What data could we find that would challenge our current assumptions? And similarly to the accident investigation team that I described in Louisiana, they said something like, you're closer to the work than I am. What do you see? It's also extremely important to respond productively when people speak up, and we will talk about that in the following weeks in the podcast. So let's think about our workout of the week. Our workout of the week this week is to find a situation where you can offer to lead or claim leadership and invite input. So something like, I'll facilitate this meeting and I'd love feedback if I'm missing anything. Here's my current thinking, but I might be overlooking something. What is it? I'm going to make the call, but before I do, what concerns or risks do you think I should consider? So to reiterate, our workout of the week is to offer to lead or claim a leadership role and explicitly invite input on the team's plan. You have been listening to Curious Now from the Center for Medical Simulation. Curious Now is produced by James Lipshaw. And if you're interested in some of the ideas here, please consider our leadership coaching service and/or our new Simulation Leader Intensive launching in August 2026.